So Trump gets up there and basically announces victory on April 1st, so a month. So it's about the top of the cycle of Beltane rather than the end of it. April 1st rather than May 1st when Bush did it. All you pagans or astute occultists know what I'm talking about. But, anyways, Trump gets out there, announces victory, claims that Iran is decimated, that the war is basically finished. We don't need their oil anymore. Clean ending. Mission accomplished, essentially. Time to wrap this up and move on. Classic stuff from the American perspective. We've all seen this story before because you've literally heard this exact story before multiple times across multiple wars, and it never actually means what it claims to mean. And here's what's actually happening. Because while he's saying this, the Pentagon is accelerating Marine deployments to the Gulf, not slowing them down, not preparing withdrawal logistics, accelerating the 31st and the 11th Marine Expeditionary Units, the USS Boxer, with 2,200 Marines on board, leaving California weeks ahead of schedule. Elements from the 82nd Airborne Immediate Response Force getting orders to pack up and head east. This is not what winding down looks like. This is what the next phase of this war looks like. The gap between what's being said and what's being done isn't confusion, it's a part of the strategy. You announce the end early so that everything comes after gets interpreted as cleanup instead of escalation. You frame it as mopping up so the public doesn't register that you're actually expanding and escalating and accelerating this war. And so this war is not over. The war is being restructured under the rhetorical cover of resolution. This is Imperial War Management 101. Perform victory through speech while the material operations deepen. And the energy independence angle in this is very interesting. And that's where it gets complex because that part is technically true. The U.S. is not a net exporter for oil right now. Domestic production has fundamentally shifted the energy equation. The U.S. is not dependent on Gulf crude the way that they were in the 70s or early 2000s, and that's obviously true. But the political use being made of that fact is something completely different. Oil markets are global. Disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, it doesn't just affect countries that import from there directly, it moves through shipping insurance, futures contracts, refinery calculations, all of it. And prices spike everywhere because the market is integrated. So when Trump says we don't need Middle Eastern oil anymore, he's not describing insulation from the region's dynamics. He's describing a shift from being a consumer dependent on Gulf supply to being a producer who benefits when the Gulf supply gets disrupted. Think about what that means strategically. If conflict or sanctions make Gulf oil unreliable, American producers win. If the strait closes or narrows, prices jump. Domestic production becomes more profitable, and countries that are buying from the Gulf start looking at the U.S. suppliers instead. And energy dependence isn't creating distance from the Middle East instability, it's weaponizing that instability as a market advantage. And that's what he's doing. The U.S. doesn't need to import the oil to care deeply about controlling who does and under what conditions. And what takes you directly to the Hormuz Strait, which is the clearest expression of what's changing here. Trump says countries that depend on the strait should protect it themselves, take responsibility for securing the choke point, or just buy from the United States instead. And for decades, that deal was implicit. America guarantees the sea lanes, keep the choke points open, provide security for global energy flows as a sort of public good. And in exchange, you get to shape the rules of the system. And that protection, it wasn't transactional. It was the overhead cost of maintaining that hegemony. You secure the commons, you get influence over the commons and how they operate. And The model is just getting scrapped. That's what's happening here. Security provision is becoming conditional, and he's essentially ratcheting up the tensions, and then also like taking, because they have a benefit in the oil market. He's just taking everybody else hostage, right? The message is essentially, if you want to keep the strait open, you pay for it, or you accept whatever political demands come with continued protection, or you shift your energy purchases towards American suppliers and the profit structures that they represent and the power structures that they represent. The third redirects global energy flows through American production. And either way, the choke point doesn't become less important. It becomes a toll gate. And that isn't American protectionism. That isn't American isolationism. This is empire learning, how to charge a rent by proxy, right? The US still controls the infrastructure, still has the capacity to close or open the strait, so they claim. But now the cost of maintaining that control gets pushed onto the countries whose economy, social, economic dependence is on what flows through that choke point in the Persian Gulf. You're not withdrawing from the region, you're converting guaranteed protection into a fee for service arrangement. And the military deployments make it impossible to pretend otherwise. If the war were genuinely winding down, you'd see force reduction, you'd see base closures, you'd see logistical contraction. Instead, you're seeing the opposite. You're seeing MEUs getting rushed forward. You're seeing airborne units heading to theater, operational planning for scenarios that require far more capacity, not less, and potential operations to seize Karg Island, reopen the strait by force, a naval blockade, secure Iranian nuclear facilities if things escalate further, which I think they might. My theory, my pocket theory here is that they might fake that and just like set up something in the Kuwaiti desert and make it look like they're retrieving the uranium from like a spot, and just like put that out and say like we went to an isolated area and we found it, and just be a complete scam. I could see that being like their one of their off ramps here. The timeline and the rhetoric don't match each other. That's the biggest thing here. Trump says 2 to 3 weeks until operations wind down. The Pentagon is developing contingencies for ground operations that will require months of sustainment. And the gap in that communication between those two things is pretty much the point here. It's as part of the strategy. One layer is public messaging, where wars get compressed into clean narratives with beginning and endings. The other layer is operational reality, where commitments deepen and mission parameters expand. The space between those layers is where escalation happens without political accountability. Meanwhile, at home, you get this split screen. On one side, the US is at peak economic performance, record investment, high market valuations, maximum productive capacity, able to project strength anywhere without constraint. And on the other side, the exact same administration says basic social infrastructure is unaffordable. We can't afford childcare. Can't do it. Healthcare expansion, can't do it. Support systems for working families, we're at war. Fiscal discipline is required to win wars. And that contradiction is the system working as designed. Military projection gets funded without debate because that's treated as the essential state function for your own national security. Social reproduction, the systems that actually sustain the population, that gets framed as discretionary spending subject to austerity. And the state has unlimited capacity to deploy the Marines to the Persian Gulf. It has no capacity to provide universal health care, universal child care. And that's not hypocrisy. That's a hierarchy of priorities embedded in how imperial political economy operates from the very beginning of America. You know what I mean? That's the treats. That's why social democracy used to be such a, everyone used to love social democracy, but then the treats ran out. And so now we're living in the inverse of that. It's just another type of social fascism in a way. It's just reactionary. I don't even know because it's like you're saying, it's like you're claiming that it's that like social democracy is happening, or at least I don't even know, social liberalism or social development, social developmentalism, social economic expansion. You're using that language, but it's just retracting further and further and further. But that's the that's how imperial political economy works, especially in these moments. Capital accumulation and the geopolitical dominance are mandatory. Everything else is negotiable. So pull it together. Energy independence gets weaponized to shift from consumer dependency to supplier leverage, and victory gets announced early to create political cover for what is continued operations, and escalation gets masked as cleanup through rhetorical framing that operational reality contracts. And security guarantees get converted into conditional transactions, and domestic strength narratives coexist with austerity requirements that are used to justify projection while constraining provision. And none of this is withdrawal. All of this is restructuring. The U.S. isn't leaving the Middle East, it's redefining how power gets exercised there. It's less as a guarantor, absorbing the costs in exchange for influence, and more as a gatekeeper, extracting payment for access to security infrastructure that it controls. It's less as a stabilizer maintaining order as a public good, and more as a force shaping instability to generate leverage over its allies and its rivals. It's literally just, it's like a mobster protection racket. That's what it is. And the language of closure is politically necessary because permanent war has limited public tolerance. So interventions get framed as temporary even when infrastructure being built is permanent. Victory gets declared even when objectives remain unmet because the declaration establishes the frame within which everything after that gets interpreted differently. And the war hasn't ended. The war is being repackaged as something that can't end while systems producing it get reorganized to extract more efficiently. Iran hasn't been neutralized to the degree that the rhetoric suggests, not at all. But that was never the actual goal here. The goal is maintaining dominance, and dominance doesn't require resolution. It requires the capacity to shape outcomes, control access, and extract value from the structures of dependency that American power creates and sustains. And this new model is hegemony operating less through provision and more through selective denial. Empire isn't ending. Empire is learning to bill for services it used to provide for influence and calling that transition a withdrawal. That's the move here. Watch the Marines deploy while the speeches talk about coming home. Watch the energy independence become more of market weaponization. Security guarantees will become fee structures, literally a protection racket. And the war and these conflicts will continue on until the fronts finally combine. The front in Africa, the front in the Middle East, and the front in Eastern Europe will all combine. And these wars will continue, and the framing will just keep adapting, and the gap between them is where the next phase happens because like someone once said, America will bleed itself dry by its own imperial overreach, and we're living in that right now. That's where we're at. I'm going to do like a full chronicle of this war in my next stream or rant episode thing soon. But apart from that, it leaves us in a place where the war isn't ending anytime soon. It's just being restructured narrative wise, where the victory speech provides cover for deepening operations, where energy independence becomes a euphemism for market weaponization, where austerity disciplines domestic spending while military expenditure remains unlimited, where Iran writes directly to Americans because the gap between state interests and popular interests has become wide enough that exploiting it is worth the attempt. And I'm not saying this ends well. I'm not saying that America's strategy is working. I'm not saying these statements that are being put out by Iranian leadership fractures consensus or changes policy or does anything except get filed away as enemy propaganda by most of the people who hear about it. Though I would say more and more people are probably listening to it. But I am saying the fact that they tried tells you something. It tells you that the consent isn't automatic anymore and that the narrative management is necessary because the material reality doesn't speak for itself. And that's the reason why Trump has to give a victory speech like this while deploying amphibious assault units. It's because if you just did the deployment without the speech, the contradiction would just be too obvious. And Trump knows how to embody contradiction, if anything. That's his skill. And every time that gap becomes visible, every time someone asks, wait, who is this actually for? The cost of maintaining the structure goes up a little bit more. But Trump is always able to just say, ah, they love me. It doesn't matter. And the objection to it is never enough to stop it. It's never enough to make it. I mean, it is unsustainable, but it's not unsustainable because of anything internal. And that's the internal stuff does matter because it will get to a tipping point where the external forces will make it so that the internal contradictions will matter more and more, enough that the machinery has to work a little harder and harder and harder, and has to coordinate the messaging a little tighter as time goes on, and has to make sure that their allies are all saying the same thing on the same day so the story holds together. And maybe that doesn't sound like much. Maybe it sounds like I'm grasping for hope in a situation that's fundamentally very bleak. And it is bleak. The war is not ending. The structure isn't collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions, although it's getting there. Hegemony, American hegemony is resilient, especially in this region, and it's resilient precisely because it doesn't require resolution. It requires the capacity to shape outcomes, control access, and extract value from the arrangements that it produces and the chaos that it produces in this instance. But resilience isn't the same as inevitability like it once was. And visibility isn't the same as powerlessness. And Iran's the letter to the people. It doesn't stop this war, but it does make the war cost a little bit more to sustain. And in a system that depends on imposing costs on others while minimizing cost to yourself, any decrease in maintenance cost is a vulnerability, as many of Iran's neighbors have learned. And that's to take advantage of those vulnerabilities, to exploit those vulnerabilities is not does not mean victory. It's not even a strategy for victory in the long term because you go up the escalation ladder. I mean, it is for if you're Iran. It isn't if you're in the United States. It becomes the people's war. You start fighting the war on their terrain, and that's where this is headed. It's a friction point, a friction because the friction accumulates, and at some point, the machinery that looked invincible starts to look more and more expensive. It's similar to any American imperial war, right? And expansive things like what's needed to do this, what's needed for victory, gets questioned more and more. And questions in a system that depend on manufacturer consent are the thing that the system is designed to prevent. And America's wars are a lot easier to stop than our wars that our allies are fighting, like in Ukraine or wherever else. Yeah, no, the war isn't ending, but the story that makes the war possible is getting harder to tell, and maybe eventually that's going to matter. Yeah, that's it. I'm Alex Station. Please go to my YouTube channel, subscribe to my YouTube channel. alex.station.ca is wired to my YouTube channel right now. Also, my Substack is there. Check me out on Twitter. And then also sparksolidarity.ca. All of my writing can be found over there. And so, yeah, thanks for watching. Talk to you later.